Okay, Voyagers, we are going into the past. Well, at least as far as looking at Greek past tenses. Greek past tenses. There are 3 Greek past tenses, of which we will be studying 2. And the past tenses that we will be studying are all about aspect. The imperfect has continuous aspect. And you remember continuous aspect is in the present was I am going, ing, right? So the imperfect in the past, tehudor ketepalan, the water was falling. The aorist, however, is undefined aspect and would be translated tehudor ketepalan as the water fell. The third one is a pluperfect, which is very rare in the New Testament, so we're not going to be looking at it right now. It has undefined aspect, and the translation would be the water had fallen. All past tenses take a prefix and have secondary endings. That is actually the definition of a past tense, that it has a prefix and secondary. Formation of past tenses. This is going to be a general formation of past tenses and not the one that we're going into next. So we begin with a past stem, and we'll look at the different types of past stems. It must have an augment, usually an epsilon. It has secondary endings. Only past tenses have secondary endings. And it may have a tense formative, but it may also not. It may be a past tense that does not take a tense formative. And in this case, elusan would be translated as they loosed. The comparison of primary and secondary endings. One of the easiest ways to learn secondary endings is to see how they differ from primary. The primary, we know the active is o, ace, a, amen, ete, usi. The secondary active is on instead of o. And then the second singular is s instead of ace. It's lost that little iota. And the same thing happens in the third singular. We have instead of a with a new movable nu. So instead of o, ace, a, we have on, s, e. Now this is a neat thing. In the first and second plural, they're identical. Amen, ete. And then the usi that we have in the primary active is on in the secondary active. And as you'll notice, the first singular and the third plural are the same. So we get on, s, e, amen, ete, on. The primary middle is also very much alike, where before we had omai, a, etai, ametha, estha, antai. The secondary takes the same form, and its main endings is the omicron instead of the alpha iota. So omai becomes omain, omai, omain. A, because it's omicron, becomes omicron upsilon instead of eta iota. The etai with the omicron, instead of etai we get eta. And remember, the first person and the second person are the same, so we get ametha, estha. And then the third plural is anta. So omain u eta, ametha, estha, anta. Now we're going to look at the imperfect indicative. And we're going to look at both the present and the middle passive deponent. Imperfect indicative components. The time is past. This is a past tense. The stem, however, is present. Remember when I asked with the future, why in the world would we say time future, stem future? This is the reason. The time is past, but the stem this verb takes is the present stem. It's going to be identical to the present stem. There is no tense formative. There is an augment, one of the signs of a past tense. The voices are identical to the present. The present is actually the mirror of the imperfect. So the voices in the present are active and middle passive. So are they in the imperfect, active and middle passive. So the passive in the imperfect, like the present, is taken with middle endings. The endings are secondary, augment, and secondary endings comprise past tenses. The aspect is continuous. The water was falling. It is not a principal part. The reason it's not a principal part is it has the same stem as the present. Now, Mounce places it in your lexicon in parentheses just to be nice, but it is not a principal part. Formation of the imperfect verb. We begin with a present stem, not the imperfect stem. We begin with a present stem. And if you remember, the present stem had two lambdas. So ball begins with a present stem with two lambdas. We have an augment, and we add secondary endings to it. So we'll get ebales, you were throwing. The imperfect active indicative of vάλλω, I throw. It's going to begin with a stem, and the stem has two lambdas, which are the same as the present, because this is the present stem. And the imperfect takes the present stem. It's going to put its augment before, and it's going to take secondary endings on s, e, amen, ete, on. So we get ebalon, I was casting, ebales, you were casting, ebale or ebalen, he, she, it was casting, ebalomen, we were casting, ebalete, you all were casting, and ebalon, they were casting. And obviously when you are parsing, ebalon is identical to first person singular as well. Augment forms. Before an initial consonant, the augment is usually just the addition of an epsilon. Before an initial vowel, that vowel will be lengthened. Before initial diphthong, the first vowel will be lengthened. And before a word with a prepositional prefix, changes will be made between the suffix and the stem. Let me show you. The most common augment comes before a consonant and only requires the addition of an epsilon. We've seen this with luo, eluo, and you add secondary endings, and you get eluan. Augment before an alpha or epsilon. If a word should begin with an alpha or epsilon, that alpha or epsilon is expanded to an eta. So let's look at this. Aresco, I am pleasing. If we put an epsilon in front of it, it expands to an eta, and we put secondary endings on here. We get arescon, I was pleasing. In the same way, epsilon also goes to an eta. So erchomai, if we put an epsilon in front, it expands to an eta. We put secondary endings on it. We get erchomein, and we get I was going. If it comes before an omicron or an omega, it expands to an omega. So, in this word anamazo, I am naming, we're going to put an epsilon in front of it. It's going to expand it to an omega. We're going to put secondary endings on, and we're going to get I was naming. Before a diphthong, it takes the same rules as it did before vowels. The only thing that you need to remember is, since the vowel is being expanded, if this is a iota diphthong, the iota will subscript. So, I am taking up is iro. If I put an epsilon up there, I'm going to get an eta with a iota subscript. And if I put secondary endings, I get aaron. I was taking up. In the same way, omicron to omega with a diphthong, and this is a iota diphthong as well. If I have oikatuo, I am inhabiting, and I put an epsilon there, I'm going to expand my omicron into omega, and the iota will subscript. And secondary endings on here, I get oikatuon, I was inhabiting. Words begin with prepositions. Prepositions cannot be altered. So an augment cannot come before the preposition. And the second reason is more important, that the word stem is what we want to augment. What happens in Greek is we have a word, say, erchomai, I am going, and we put a word in front of it, eis erchomai, going into. But what we care about changing is the stem, the base word erchomai. So we're going to begin, and the word we're using, of course, is eis erchomai, I am coming into. So the first thing that we do is separate the preposition from the stem. That way we can see the word, the letter it is that we have to change. And that is an epsilon. So in this case, we know that a word that begins with epsilon is going to be expanded. So when we bring that augment here, it's going to change it to an eta. So it's going to change erch to erch. Okay? We put secondary endings on it, and we get eis erchomein, I was coming into. So let's just look at some imperfect active examples. The present is chemes balomen. We are casting. 2 lambdas there, present stem. The imperfect is chemes ebalomen. 2 lambdas, that epsilon in front, that augment. And it turns out that amen, the first person plural, has the same endings as the present. So we get we were casting. But still, we want to have the continuous. Present, ha'achlas, blepe. The crowd is seeing. Imperfect is ha'achlas, ha'eblepe. The crowd was seeing. Middle passive indicative of vάλλω. Remember, in the present, the middle passive is used for the passive. That is, the middle endings are also the passive endings. So it's also true in the imperfect. In the imperfect, the middle endings can also be passive endings. So let's look at it. The stem we're going to use is ball. It's the present stem because the imperfect takes the present stem. We're going to always put an augment before. And the endings that we're going to have are middle endings. So we're going to have amen, u, eta, ameta, esta, anta. And the word that we're going to get is ebalomen, I was being cast. The passive here was being. Ebalu, you were being cast. Ebalete, he, she, it was being cast. Ebalametha, we were being cast. Ebaleste, you all were being cast. And ebalanta, they were being cast. Let's parse an imperfect active. Ebalete, okay? First of all, you see that present stand ball. That ending you see there is a standard active ending, and you see the augment in front. So, first thing that you know is this is second person plural, right? That's what the ending tells you, ete. The tense, well, we have present stem and an augment here, so it's got to be imperfect. The voice is active. The mood, indicative. And the lexical form, we go back to vάλλω. And the meaning is, you were casting. Parsing an imperfect passive. Remember, in the imperfect, the passive and middle endings are the same. So, to parse an imperfect passive means you're going to parse a verb that has passive endings. So we have ebaleste, and that este is second person plural. The tense is, well, the fact that it has ball has a present stem and an augment, we know that it's the imperfect. The voice is middle passive. We say middle passive because we don't know if it's a passive or it's being used as a middle. Odds are it's being used as a passive. The mood is indicative. Vάλλω is its lexical form, and its meaning is you were being cast. Parsing an imperfect deponent. Remember, a deponent has active meaning but takes middle endings. Therefore, in the present and the imperfect, it will take the same endings as the passive. But you will know that it's not a passive because you will have learned it in your vocabulary as a deponent. That is, in your vocabulary, the word will end with omai rather than o, right? So let's go ahead. Eperueta, the person, eta, that tau tells us third person. Eta is singular rather than anta. The tense, well, it has an augment and present endings, which is going to tell us right away it's imperfect. The voice is deponent. Mood, indicative. Lexical form, peruomai, that's how we knew this was a deponent. And its meaning is he, she, it was going. Vocabulary, chapter 21. Akluteo, akluteo, akluteo. Epsilon contract means I follow or accompaniment. It takes its object in the dative of accompaniment. Akluteo. Didasko, didasko, didasko. Didasko is I teach. Eperotao, eperotao, eperotao. Alpha contract, I ask for, question, or demand of. Thello, thello, thello. I wish, will, desire, enjoy. Peripateo, peripateo. peripateo. Epsilon contract, I walk around or live. Synagogue, synagogue, synagogue. First declension, feminine, synagogue or meeting. Pharisaios, 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 masculine, Pharisee. Kranas, 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 second declension, masculine. Time, this is time in your watch. Second aorist indicative, active and middle. Aorist, the third principal part. So far you've had the present, the second was the future, and now the aorist is a third principal part. The tense is past. Its aspect is undefined. This is as opposed to the continuous aspect of the imperfect that we just had. So this is the second of the past tenses. The aorist has two forms. One's called first aorist and one's called second aorist. This has nothing to do with meaning. They're merely forms. And as you look at them, you'll see them. The important thing is to know is a verb is not both first and second aorist. It's either first aorist or second aorist. But it is still aorist, and it still has undefined aspect. There is no difference between the meaning of the forms. So we're going to begin with second aorist indicative, and there's a very good reason for this. It takes the same endings as the imperfect that we just saw, looks just like it, except it's going to take a different stem. So the time is past again. The stem is aorist. Okay, remember the imperfect, the stem was present. The stem is aorist, it's a new stem. The tense formative is none. It has no tense formative, just like the imperfect. Yes, it has an augment, it's a past tense. And the voices have three separate forms. Active, middle, and deponent will be there, and passive. So unlike the imperfect, which had active, middle, passive, the aorist will have active, middle, and passive. The endings are secondary, and the aspect is undefined. The water falls, rather than the water is falling. It's the third principal part, present, future, and aorist. Formation of the second aorist verb. So we're going to start with an aorist stem, and you'll notice this stem is different from the present stem. The present stem had two lambdas, but the aorist stem only has one. So one of the things you're going to note about the second aorist is the stem will be different from the present. It has an augment of epsilon, and it's going to take the same secondary endings that the imperfect took. So we're going to get ebales, you threw. If I had two lambdas, it would have been you were throwing. The relationship of the imperfect to the second aorist. Both are past tenses. Both take an augment, and it's usually an epsilon. Neither has a tense formative. Both share secondary endings, both in the active and the middle. The imperfect is built on the present stem, and therefore continuous. The second aorist is built on the aorist stem, and therefore undefined. So the formation of the second aorist is the imperfect would have been vall with two lambdas, the epsilon before, and then secondary endings. And we would have had ebales, you were throwing. The second aorist is aristem, 1 lambda, with an epsilon in front of it, and the same secondary endings, and you threw. As you see, the difference between an imperfect and the aorist is this stem. Let's look at the vocabulary for chapter 22. Abathnesko, abathnesko, abathnesko. I die, I'm about to die. Auditas, auditas, auditas. Second declension, masculine, bread. Vάλλω, βάλλω, βάλλω. I throw. Gay, gay, gay. First declension, feminine, earth or land. Ginomai, ginomai, ginomai. Learn this one, it's extremely important. I become or am. Eis erkomai, eis erkomai, eis erkomai. This is one of a series of many, many words in which a preposition is added to the front of erkomai. And you can see why, if you're going to add an augment, you wouldn't add it to eis, but you would want to add it to erkomai, because that is the main word. So eis erkomai is to enter or come in. Ex erkomai, ex erkomai, ex erkomai is to go out. Eti, 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 still yet. Horisko, horisko, horisko. Eureka comes from this, I find. Lambano, lambano, lambano. Know this second declension, I take or receive. Ute, ute, ute. And not, neither or nor. Pros erkomai, pros erkomai, pros erkomai. Another preposition to erkomai. I go to. Prosuchomai, prosuchomai, prosuchomai. I pray. Pur, pur, pur. Third declension, neuter.